Welcome to the third Nalanda Guides webinar. I am Harshal Garg, the founder of Nalanda Guides, and our webinar today will cover the American Revolution, the second major topic in Unit 3 of the APUSH curriculum. Last week, if you remember, we covered the French and Indian War and the causes of the American Revolution, so feel free to check that out. And first off is the American Revolution. So basically, here's a timeline, here's a map, and you may remember from last webinar that the brief skirmish between the colonists and the British at the Battle of Lexington and Concord near Boston started the Revolution. So basically, the colonists had a brief skirmish with the British over an arsenal that the colonists had created at Concord, and this is regarded as the start of the American Revolution. So after the skirmish, delegates from each of the colonies met in Philadelphia as a Second Continental Congress. They drafted the Olive Branch Petition, giving one last chance to Britain to reconcile its relationship with the colonies, but when King George III of Britain refused, the colonists knew that war would continue into a full-on battle. One colonist, Thomas Paine, published a pamphlet called Common Sense to urge people to support the war effort. Thus, the colonists drafted the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776, claiming their independence from Britain. The document echoed John Locke's ideals of the natural rights of man and also listed the grievances against the king. Many people hated this independence, especially the Loyalists, who were the colonists who were loyal to the Britain. These people are also known as Tories, and they comprised about 25% of the colonists. Because the colonies claimed independence, they needed a national government to unify the colonies. So because of this, some of the founding fathers created the Articles of Confederation in 1777, which was fully ratified in 1781. More on this would come later in the lecture, toward the end. Now, after the Declaration of Independence, the colonies needed to fully mobilize for war. They organized armies, pressured gunsmiths, printed paper money to raise revenue, which caused inflation, and they also created an arsenal at Springfield, Massachusetts. The colonies were very decentralized, and each state had its own army. So to unify all the colonies, Congress created the Continental Army, appointing George Washington, the same George Washington who would later become the first president of the U.S. He became the general of the Continental Army. Now the revolution started in Boston. So basically, after the initial battles of Lexington and Concord, came the Battle of Bunker Hill in June 1775 in Boston. This was a British victory. The colonists and the British had some more skirmishes, and in March 1776, the British evacuated thousands of loyalists to Nova Scotia. Thus, the colonists sent Generals Benedict Arnold and Richard Montgomery to Canada to prevent the Canadians from providing British aid, but they failed to siege Quebec. And as you can see in a map over here, this is a map of the first stage of the war. This is the Springfield Arsenal. This orange dot. This red dot is the Battle of Lexington and Concord. This blue dot is the Battle of Bunker Hill. And here, as you can see, the British moved the Loyalists from New England to Nova Scotia in Canada. Now we come to Phase 2 of the American Revolution. The second phase takes place from 1776 to 1778. First, the British general William Howe drove Washington's army out of New York City, as you can see here with this purple arrow. He drove them through New Jersey and finally into Pennsylvania. Now, this was in late 1776. Now, during the winter of 1776 to 1777, William Howe's army just rested in military bases they planted throughout New Jersey, and this was because the British were used to seasonal warfare, in which they only fight during the spring, summer, and fall, and they just rest during the winter. However, what they did is that they settled in various bases, and they put German mercenaries that they hired, which are known as Hessians, in charge of looking out for the colonists. However, Washington had no concept of seasonal warfare, and he believed that fighting warfare is year-round, including the winter. So during the winter time of 1777, he attacked the British bases at Trenton and Princeton. You can see with the red and blue dots here. However, he was unable to maintain control of them. Then Howe came up with a new plan. He would take his army upward from New York into Albany, and General John Burgoyne would go to Canada and take his army downward into the upper Hudson Valley. The colonists had many forts in upstate New York in this area, so the British planned to trap the colonists there. However, Howe abandoned this plan, leaving Burgoyne alone, and he attacked Washington's army near Philadelphia. before Washington could retreat to Valley Forge. Valley Forge is right here for the winter of 1777 to 1778. In the north, Burgoyne took over Fort Ticonderoga, which is shown here, but he lost a few other battles which weakened his army. So then he sought to take over Fort Saratoga, and the colonial general Horatio Gates trapped his army, causing him to surrender. As you can see, Howe made a few mistakes that cost him the war. He shouldn't have left Burgoyne alone, and he should have attacked Washington while he was in Valley Forge, because when Washington retreated to Valley Forge for the winter of 1777 to 1778, he ran out of supplies, and he had to ask the local farmers for supplies. However, the war was not over yet. The Iroquois played a major role in the war as the British recruited them to their army. The Iroquois believed the British would protect the Iroquois from the encroachment of the colonists. However, the Iroquois Confederacy started to unravel because some of the tribes, as part of the Confederacy, allied with the colonists, and the others allied with the British. After this, the colonists secured French aid in the war. Louis XVI of France and his foreign minister, Count de Vergennes, agreed to help the colonists because they wanted to defeat the British after losing the French and Indian War. And now the final phase of the war comes in the Southern Colonies. In the map you see here, you can see Lord Cornwallis was appointed as the commander of the British forces in the south, and he took over many cities including Charlestown and Savannah. But he was at a disadvantage because he was moving through enemy territory, so the colonial farmers would often attack the British as they passed through the countryside, and the most notable colonial farmer is Swamp Fox, who attacked a lot of British as they moved throughout his farm. Nathaniel Green took charge of the colonial forces, and he defeated the British at the Battle of King's Mountain, this blue circle. Later, he lost at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, which is seen by this red circle, but Cornwallis also lost a lot of men, which weakened his army. Now after this, Cornwallis retreated to Yorktown to wait for some British ships to carry his soldiers to either New York or Charlestown, but while he was there, George Washington and his French allies moved to Yorktown and trapped him there, causing him to surrender. However, the war still wasn't fully over because the British had control of many colonial ports, including Savannah and Charlestown. But eventually, in September of 1783, the British agreed to the Treaty of Paris, ending the war, recognizing the independence of the colonies. Now, during the war, many loyalists fled to Canada or England, and most of them had prominent roles in the colonies, especially with colonial ties to Britain. So when they left, other colonists were able to fill their spots. Additionally, attitudes towards Anglicans worsened because people associated the Anglicans with the British, and the colonists actually gained closer ties to the Catholics because when the French Catholics came to help the colonists started to appreciate the Catholics more. Now, the British recruited many slaves to join the war, and other slaves took advantage of the war to defect. The British also emancipated some of the slaves to disrupt the American war effort. As revolutionary ideals and the idea of liberty spread throughout the colonies, ideas of abolitionism and emancipation of slaves spread throughout the North. Eventually, slavery was abolished in the North. However, in the South, ideas of white superiority spread, and the whites believed that they could only get liberty if the blacks remained enslaved. So because of that, the slavery remained in the South. Now, during the war, many Indians joined the British Army during the war because they hated the westward encroachment of the colonists. They believed that the British would save them from the westward encroachment of the colonists. Many Indians led raids on the white settlements, most notably a Cherokee man who was called Dragging Canoe. In 1774, the Shawnee Indians led raids on white settlements, sparking Lord Dunmore's War, but they couldn't get other Indian tribes to help them, so the colonists won that war. During the war, many women grew in power because their husbands were away at war, so the women could manage the household and gain a lot of property. Some women even went to the battlefield, mostly performing auxiliary tasks like laundry and cooking. However, a few women, most notably Molly Pitcher, actually joined the battlefield and fought. After the war, as the ideas of the equality of men spread, like John Locke's idea, that's now in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, this challenged the rights of women, but it also promoted the traditional role of women, that women should remain subordinate to men, and that women should have motherly behavior. And also, during and after the war, Britain wouldn't trade with the colonies, which actually strengthened the colonial economy because now the colonies could trade with other regions and other countries like the Caribbean and South America. Many private merchant groups, most notably the Yankees, carried out such operations. Also, domestic industry in the U.S. boomed because during the colonial boycotts of the British goods to protest the British taxes, many people designed domestic economies, such as homespun cloth and munitions factories, because they didn't want to get British goods, and these domestic industries carried on. Now, after winning the war, the colonies struggled to build a strong national government. The states wielded such enormous power over the national government, and each state had a strong executive and legislative branch. All of these states had religious toleration after Virginia adopted the Statute of Religious Toleration proposed by Thomas Jefferson, and only the states in the South had slavery. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, the Articles of Confederation was the name of the American government after independence. This was ruled by a Congress and no single president. This was very inefficient because all of the 13 states had to approve any proposed amendments, and all of the 13 states had to approve the articles before its ratification, and this was prone to lots of disagreement because the smaller states wanted equal representation in the Confederation, whereas the larger states wanted more representation because they had a higher population. So this led to its inefficiency, and the states had enormous power over the Confederation. The Confederation had no power to levy taxes, it only managed foreign relations, so it struggled to impose its will on the states because it had to encourage each state to impose taxes if it wanted to levy taxes. Another problem was dealing with all the land west of the Appalachian Mountains. Many people settled there, and in the Ordinance of 1784, this land was divided into 10 districts, each of which could petition for statehood once its population reached a certain amount. In the Ordinance of 1785, the land was divided into 36 square-mile grids called a township, each with 36 plots of 1 square mile. Each township had one city center and one public school. This organization of land still exists today. As you can see, the towns of the countryside of the America in places like Kansas and Nebraska are still located about 6 miles apart, and that's because of the Ordinance of 1785. Now, in the Ordinance of 1787, all of this land was combined into one district instead of 10 districts, and this one district had civil rights like religious toleration, no slavery, and the right to trial by jury. All this land was owned by the Indians, which angered them, so in 1790 and 1791, an Indian named Little Turtle led a group of Miami tribesmen to attack the Americans, killing 630 whites. However, they were unable to negotiate a treaty, and in 1794, the Americans defeated the Indians at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, so the Indians had to cede more territory to the Americans in the Treaty of Greenville. And finally, after the war, the Confederation had lots of debts, and since it couldn't levy taxes on its own, it petitioned the states to levy taxes, but it only raised 1/6 the amount it needed. So Robert Morris, the head of the Confederation's treasury, imposed a national tax, causing lots of protest. Many farmers didn't want to pay the extra tax on top of the already high state taxes. So because of this, a New England man named Daniel Chase created a list of demands pertaining to tax relief, and he went to the Springfield Arsenal that the government built before the American Revolution. This is the same arsenal that I talked about earlier. However, a militia came before him and dispersed his followers, and this event is known as Shays' Rebellion. So now I'll just give a brief summary of my lecture. So the start of the Revolution was the Battle of Lexington and Concord and the Battle of Bunker Hill. When the British briefly evacuated the colonies to take the Loyalists to Nova Scotia, the colonists organized the Second Continental Congress to write the Declaration of Independence, fully committing to and mobilizing for the war. So as you can see here, there are some battles in Boston, and then the British evacuated all the Loyalists to Nova Scotia. The second phase of the war was a victory for the colonists as they trapped the British at Fort Saratoga, and this yellow circle is Fort Saratoga. And then the French came to provide aid, allowing the colonists to trap the British and Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown. As you can see here, this is Lord Cornwallis's path, and these are the Washington's and French armies, and they trapped Cornwallis at Yorktown over here. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, ended the war, giving the U.S. its independence. Many slaves, women, and Indians were involved in the war. After the war, America struggled to build a strong national government. Each state had too much power, and the Articles of Confederation, which was the new national government, needed the approval of all states for any amendments. The Confederation struggled to impose its will on states, and it struggled to deal with the land west of the Appalachians. Eventually, it had to levy taxes to pay off its war debts, and many farmers revolted, complaining that both the state and the national taxes are too high, sparking Shays' Rebellion.